The handcuffs clicked around my wrists as Sheriff Karen smiled that cold smile I had grown to hate. My cattle stood watching from behind the fence as 6 armed deputies ransacked my barn, throwing hay bales and overturning feed buckets. They had been searching for 3 hours. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. But that did not matter to Karen. She leaned close to my ear and whispered the words that changed everything. "I planted something in your truck last night. You are going to prison." That was when I realized this war was far from over. 6 months earlier, life was simple on my ranch outside Cedar Falls. I woke every morning at 5:30 to the sound of roosters crowing and cattle lowing in the distance. The sun would rise over the mountains, casting long shadows across the pasture where my 100 head of cattle grazed peacefully. This was the life I had built after 20 years of working construction in the city. This was my sanctuary. My nearest neighbor was old Pete Martinez, whose property bordered mine to the south. We would wave to each other across the fence line every morning as we went about our chores. Pete had been ranching this land for 40 years, and he taught me everything I knew about raising cattle. The other ranchers in the area were good people too, hard-working folks who minded their own business and helped their neighbors when needed. Cedar Falls was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone. Population 3,000 on a good day. Main Street had one diner, one hardware store, one gas station, and the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office had been run by Sheriff Tom Bradley for 15 years. He was a fair man who kept the peace without causing trouble for law-abiding citizens like myself. But Sheriff Bradley retired 6 months before my troubles began. The town council appointed his replacement without much fanfare. Her name was Karen Hutchinson, and she had transferred from a larger county where she claimed to have experience with serious crime. She promised to bring law and order to Cedar Falls. She promised to clean up what she called the corruption and lawlessness that had been allowed to fester under the previous administration. At first, I paid little attention to the change in leadership. I had never had any dealings with law enforcement beyond the occasional speeding ticket. I kept to myself, worked my land, and stayed out of trouble. The most exciting thing that happened on my ranch was when a cow got loose and wandered onto the county road. Even then, the deputies who helped me round her up were polite and professional. I should have known something was wrong when Pete stopped waving to me in the mornings. I should have paid attention when the other ranchers at the feed store started giving me strange looks. I should have asked questions when my usual suppliers began acting nervous around me. But I was focused on my cattle and my land. I thought the community I had grown to love was still the same peaceful place I had moved to 3 years earlier. Sheriff Karen Hutchinson arrived at my ranch on a Tuesday morning in March. I was fixing a broken fence post when I saw the 3 patrol cars coming up my dirt driveway, kicking up clouds of dust behind them. My first thought was that something had happened to Pete or one of the other neighbors. Maybe they needed my help with something. I walked over to meet them as they parked near my house. Sheriff Hutchinson stepped out of the lead car, followed by 2 deputies I did not recognize. She was a tall woman with short blonde hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. Her uniform was pressed and spotless, and her badge caught the morning sunlight as she approached. "Are you the owner of this property?" she asked without introducing herself or explaining why she was there. "Yes, ma'am, I am. Is there something I can help you with?" I wiped my hands on my work shirt and tried to be polite despite the strange tone of her voice. "We are conducting a routine inspection of livestock operations in this county. There have been reports of animal neglect and possible illegal activities at various ranches in the area." She pulled out a clipboard and began writing something down. I looked around at my healthy cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture. Their coats were shiny, their water troughs were full, and they had plenty of good grass to eat. Anyone could see these animals were well cared for. I am not sure what you mean by illegal activities, Sheriff. This is a legitimate cattle operation. I have all my permits and documentation if you would like to see them. That will not be necessary right now, she said, walking past me toward the barn without invitation. The two deputies followed her, their hands resting on their service weapons in a way that made me uncomfortable. For the next hour, they walked around my property asking questions that seemed designed to find fault rather than gather information. Sheriff Hutchinson questioned every aspect of my operation, from how I fed my cattle to where I stored my equipment. She took photographs of everything, including my house, my truck, and even my mailbox. "Where did you get the money to buy this ranch?" she asked as we stood near my back porch. "I worked construction for 20 years and saved up. I also took out a loan from the bank in town, all perfectly legal and documented." She wrote something else on her clipboard and gave me a look that made my skin crawl. "We will be checking on that. There have been concerns raised about how some people in this area acquire their property and funding." "What kind of concerns? Who raised them?" I asked, genuinely confused about what she was implying. "That is part of an ongoing investigation that I cannot discuss with you at this time." She closed her clipboard and nodded to the deputies. "We will be in touch if we need anything else." As they walked back to their cars, Sheriff Hutchinson turned around one more time. "Just so we understand each other, I run a tight ship in this county. I do not tolerate any kind of criminal activity, no matter how small. I suggest you make sure everything you do here is completely above board." I watched their cars disappear down my driveway, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust with more questions than answers. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong, but I could not put my finger on what it was. I had been cooperative and respectful, yet she treated me like I was already guilty of something. Over the next 2 months, Sheriff Hutchinson made it clear that I was now her primary target. The harassment started small but grew more intense with each passing week. Every time I drove into town, one of her deputies would find a reason to pull me over. Broken tail light, expired registration that was actually current, suspicion of speeding in a zone where I was driving 5 miles under the limit. Each traffic stop followed the same pattern. The deputy would approach my truck with his hand on his weapon and ask me to step out of the vehicle. They would search my truck without my consent, claiming they smelled marijuana or had received reports of suspicious activity. They never found anything because there was nothing to find, but they made sure to take their time and cause as much inconvenience as possible. The psychological toll was worse than the legal harassment. I began to dread leaving my ranch because I knew I would be stopped and humiliated on the road. The deputies would make me stand on the side of the highway while they tore apart my truck, all while other residents of Cedar Falls drove past and watched. I could see the questions in their eyes. What had I done wrong? Why were the police always stopping me? Sheriff Hutchinson also began visiting my ranch unannounced, claiming she was following up on various complaints that had been filed against me. Complaints about noise, even though my nearest neighbor was half a mile away. Complaints about property violations, even though my land was properly surveyed and maintained. Complaints about my cattle, even though they were healthy and well cared for. Each visit was more invasive than the last. She would demand to see documents and permits that I had already shown her multiple times. She would bring different deputies with her and have them photograph everything from new angles. She would ask the same questions over and over, as if she was trying to catch me in some kind of lie or contradiction. The worst part was discovering that she had been conducting background investigations on me without my knowledge. I found out when my banker, Jim Morrison, pulled me aside at the hardware store one day. Listen, I probably should not be telling you this, but Sheriff Hutchinson has been asking a lot of questions about your finances. She wanted to know where your money came from, how much you borrowed, what you spend it on. I told her it was none of her business, but she made it sound like you were under investigation for something serious. Other business owners in town began treating me differently too. The manager at the feed store, who had always been friendly and helpful, suddenly became cold and professional. He would not make eye contact when I came in to buy supplies for my cattle. The mechanic who serviced my truck started asking for payment up front instead of letting me pay when the work was done, the way we had always handled it before. Even Pete, my neighbor and friend, began avoiding me. I would see him working in his pasture, but he would turn away when I waved. One evening I walked over to his fence line to ask if everything was all right. "Pete, did I do something to upset you? You have been acting strange lately." He looked around nervously before answering. "That new sheriff came by my place last week. She was asking questions about you. Wanted to know if I had seen any suspicious activity on your property, if I had noticed strange people coming and going, if I knew anything about your background." "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that you are a good neighbor who keeps to himself and takes care of his animals, but she kept pushing like she wanted me to say something bad about you. It made me uncomfortable." He paused and looked toward my ranch. "Maybe you should talk to a lawyer or something. This does not feel right." That night I sat on my porch and watched the sun set over my land. For the first time since moving to Cedar Falls, I felt truly alone. Sheriff Hutchinson was systematically destroying my reputation and isolating me from my community, and I had no idea why. The raid happened on a Friday morning in May. I woke up to the sound of helicopters circling overhead and the rumble of multiple vehicles racing up my driveway. Through my bedroom window, I could see at least 6 patrol cars, 2 unmarked SUVs, and what looked like a SWAT van parked around my house. I threw on my clothes and stepped onto my front porch to find myself staring down the barrels of a dozen assault rifles. Sheriff Hutchinson stood behind her officers with a megaphone in her hand and a smile on her face that told me she had been looking forward to this moment for months. "Put your hands where we can see them and get on the ground," she shouted through the megaphone, even though I was standing less than 20 feet away from her. "What is this about? What do you want?" I asked, raising my hands above my head. "You are under arrest for suspicion of drug trafficking, money laundering, and operating an illegal enterprise. We have a warrant to search this property and all structures on it." 2 deputies rushed forward and forced me to the ground, pressing my face into the dirt of my own front yard. The handcuffs cut into my wrists as they pulled my arms behind my back. My cattle, spooked by the helicopters and commotion, began running around the pasture in panic. "This is insane. I have never sold drugs in my life. I do not even smoke cigarettes." I tried to keep my voice calm, but my heart was racing and my mouth was dry with fear. Sheriff Hutchinson walked over and knelt down next to where I lay on the ground. "We received a tip from a reliable informant that you have been using this ranch as a distribution center for methamphetamine and other controlled substances. We also have evidence that you have been laundering money through fake cattle sales." "That is completely false. You can check my books, my bank records, anything you want. This is a legitimate operation." "Oh, we will be checking everything," she said, standing up and brushing dirt off her knees. "Take him to the car and keep him there while we conduct our search." For the next 6 hours, I sat in the back of a patrol car with my hands cuffed behind me, watching Sheriff Hutchinson and her team tear my life apart. They ransacked my house, throwing furniture around and emptying every drawer and closet onto the floor. They destroyed my office, scattering financial records and personal documents everywhere. They even broke apart my kitchen cabinets, claiming they were looking for hidden compartments. The search of my barn was even worse. They tore open bags of feed, scattered hay everywhere, and overturned every piece of equipment I owned. They brought in drug-sniffing dogs that found nothing but continued searching anyway. They took apart my tractor engine and even dug holes in the dirt floor, looking for buried contraband that did not exist. My cattle were terrified by the chaos. Some of them broke through the fence and ran into the neighboring pasture. Others huddled together in the far corner of the field, too scared to come near the barn where all the activity was happening. Watching my animals suffer because of Sheriff Hutchinson's vendetta against me was almost worse than watching her destroy my property. By late afternoon, it was clear that they had found nothing illegal on my ranch. No drugs, no evidence of money laundering, no indication of any criminal activity whatsoever. But instead of apologizing for the mistake and leaving me alone, Sheriff Hutchinson seemed to become more angry and determined. She walked over to the patrol car where I had been sitting for hours and opened the door. "This is not over. Just because we did not find anything today does not mean you are innocent. I know what you are, and I am going to prove it. What I am is a law-abiding citizen who owns a legitimate cattle ranch. You have destroyed my property and terrorized my animals for no reason. I want to know who made these false accusations against me. The identity of our informant is confidential, but I can tell you that we have been watching you for months, and we know more about your operation than you think." She slammed the car door and walked away, leaving me to sit in handcuffs for another hour before one of her deputies finally released me. By the time they left my property, my house was destroyed, my barn was in ruins, and my cattle were scattered and traumatized. That night, I sat among the wreckage of my home and made a decision. If Sheriff Hutchinson wanted a war, she was going to get one. I started my counterattack the next morning by driving to the county courthouse and filing a formal complaint against Sheriff Hutchinson and her department. The clerk who took my paperwork looked nervous when I explained what had happened at my ranch. "You are not the first person to file a complaint about the new sheriff," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "There have been several others in the past few months." "What kind of complaints?" I asked. "I cannot give you specific details, but let me just say that Sheriff Hutchinson has a very different approach to law enforcement than Sheriff Bradley did. Some people think she goes too far." That afternoon, I began making phone calls to other ranchers and business owners in the area. I wanted to know if anyone else had been targeted by Sheriff Hutchinson's harassment campaign. What I discovered shocked me. Tom Wilson, who owned a horse ranch 5 miles south of my property, had been subjected to 3 surprise inspections in 2 months. Each time, Sheriff Hutchinson claimed she was following up on anonymous complaints about animal abuse. Each time, she found nothing wrong but made sure to treat Tom like a criminal in front of his customers and employees. Sarah Chen, who ran a small trucking company out of her farm, had been pulled over and searched so many times that she was afraid to drive her own trucks. Sheriff Hutchinson claimed she was investigating reports of drug smuggling, but never found any evidence to support the accusations. Even Frank Rodriguez, who owned the largest auto repair shop in town, had been targeted. Sheriff Hutchinson accused him of running a chop shop and obtained a warrant to search his property. She found nothing illegal but destroyed thousands of dollars worth of tools and equipment in the process. The pattern was clear. Sheriff Hutchinson was systematically harassing successful business owners and property owners throughout the county, using her badge to justify behavior that would have been criminal if anyone else had done it. I decided to reach out to some of these victims and see if they would be willing to work together to document what was happening. Most of them were scared to speak up because they feared retaliation, but a few agreed to meet with me privately. We started meeting every Tuesday evening at Tom Wilson's ranch, away from town where Sheriff Hutchinson's deputies were less likely to spot us. At first, there were only 4 of us, but word spread quietly through the community, and soon we had 8 people sharing their stories and comparing notes. The most valuable ally I found was Deputy Marcus Cole, a 20-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department who had worked under Sheriff Bradley. Marcus was disgusted by what his department had become under Sheriff Hutchinson's leadership, and he was willing to help us document her illegal activities. "She is destroying the reputation of this department and turning us into her personal attack force," he told me during a secret meeting at a diner 2 counties over. "Half the deputies know what she is doing is wrong, but they are afraid to speak up because she fires anyone who questions her methods." Marcus began keeping detailed records of Sheriff Hutchinson's orders and activities. He copied reports, recorded conversations, and photographed evidence that showed she was using department resources for personal vendettas rather than legitimate law enforcement. The most damning evidence came when Marcus discovered that Sheriff Hutchinson had been accessing confidential law enforcement databases to conduct unauthorized background checks on her targets. She was also using department equipment to conduct surveillance without proper warrants or legal justification. "She has been building files on you and the others for months," Marcus told me. "Personal information, financial records, anything she can use to intimidate or harass you. None of it is related to any actual criminal investigation." By the end of the summer, our group had compiled a comprehensive dossier documenting Sheriff Hutchinson's pattern of abuse and corruption. We had witness statements, photographs, financial records, and insider testimony from Marcus and 2 other deputies who had grown tired of being used as tools of harassment. Now we needed a plan to bring her down. Setting the trap required patience and perfect timing. We spent weeks planning every detail, knowing that we would only get one chance to catch Sheriff Hutchinson in the act of committing a crime that could not be explained away or covered up. The plan was simple but risky. I would create a situation that would trigger her worst impulses, then document her illegal response with hidden cameras and reliable witnesses. Marcus would make sure that honest deputies were in position to arrest her when she crossed the line from harassment into outright criminal behavior. We chose my ranch as the location because Sheriff Hutchinson had already established a pattern of illegal searches and harassment there. Any jury would be able to see that her actions were part of an ongoing campaign of abuse rather than legitimate law enforcement. The trigger was a fake anonymous tip that I was planning to sell my cattle and flee the county to avoid prosecution. Marcus made sure this information reached Sheriff Hutchinson through channels that would make her think she had discovered it on her own. I knew she would not be able to resist the opportunity to catch me in what she believed would be criminal activity. Her ego and her hatred of me would override her judgment, and she would act without proper warrants or legal authority. On the morning of the operation, I made sure everything was ready. Tom Wilson and Sarah Chen were hidden in my barn with video cameras. Marcus had positioned himself and 2 other honest deputies where they could monitor radio communications and respond quickly when needed. I had a digital recording device in my shirt pocket and backup cameras hidden around my property. Sheriff Hutchinson arrived exactly as we predicted, with 4 deputies and a sense of urgency that told me she thought she had me cornered. She jumped out of her patrol car and marched toward me with her handcuffs already out. "Where do you think you are going?" she demanded, grabbing my arm before I could answer. "I am not going anywhere. I am just doing my morning chores like always." I kept my voice calm and cooperative, knowing that everything was being recorded. "Do not lie to me. We know you are planning to sell your cattle and skip town. We have evidence that you are trying to hide assets from our investigation." "What investigation? You have never filed any formal charges against me. You have never even told me what crime you think I committed." She pulled out her handcuffs and grabbed my wrist. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and attempting to flee prosecution." "I have not been charged with anything to flee from. You cannot arrest me for planning to sell my own cattle on my own property." That was when she made the mistake we had been waiting for. In her anger and frustration, she revealed the extent of her illegal surveillance and harassment campaign. "We have been watching you for months. We know about your financial records, your phone calls, your meetings with the other troublemakers in this county. We know you have been organizing them against me, trying to undermine my authority." "How do you know about my phone calls? Do you have a warrant to tap my phone?" She realized she had said too much, but it was too late. The recording devices had captured her confession to conducting illegal surveillance. More importantly, she had just admitted that her entire campaign against me was personal rather than professional. "I do not need a warrant to investigate criminal activity," she said, trying to recover from her mistake. "But you just said you were investigating me for organizing people against you personally. That is not criminal activity. That is protected speech under the First Amendment." She was getting more angry and desperate, which was exactly what we wanted. Angry people make bigger mistakes. "You have been interfering with police business and encouraging others to file false complaints against my department. That is obstruction of justice." Filing complaints about police misconduct is not obstruction of justice. It is every citizen's right, unless you are admitting that there has been misconduct to complain about. She snapped. In front of multiple witnesses and recording devices, Sheriff Hutchinson crossed the line from harassment into outright criminal assault. She shoved me against my truck and raised her baton as if she was going to strike me. "You think you are so smart. You think you can challenge me and get away with it. I am the law in this county, and I will destroy anyone who tries to undermine my authority." That was when Marcus and the other deputies moved in. They had heard enough to know that Sheriff Hutchinson was no longer acting as a law enforcement officer, but as a criminal who happened to be wearing a badge. "Sheriff Hutchinson, you are under arrest," Marcus announced as he approached with his own handcuffs ready. The look of shock and disbelief on her face was worth all the months of harassment and humiliation she had put me through. For the first time since this nightmare began, Karen Hutchinson was the one being handcuffed and placed in the back of a patrol car. The news of Sheriff Hutchinson's arrest spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. By evening, reporters from 3 different television stations had arrived in town to cover the story. The footage of her being arrested on my ranch played on the local news that night, and by morning it had been picked up by national media outlets. The district attorney moved quickly to file formal charges against her: abuse of power, illegal surveillance, harassment, assault, and violation of civil rights under color of law. Each charge carried serious prison time, and the evidence we had compiled made conviction almost certain. But the real vindication came when other victims of her harassment campaign finally felt safe to come forward with their own stories. The local newspaper ran a series of articles documenting the full extent of her abuse of power. Ranchers, business owners, and ordinary citizens shared their experiences of being targeted by Sheriff Hutchinson for no reason other than her personal prejudices and desire for power. Tom Wilson went public with the story of how she had destroyed his horse training business with false accusations and harassment. Sarah Chen testified about how the constant traffic stops had cost her trucking company thousands of dollars in lost contracts and damaged reputation. Frank Rodriguez showed photographs of the destruction caused when she illegally searched his auto repair shop. Even more damaging were the revelations from Marcus and the other deputies, who testified about the culture of corruption and abuse within the sheriff's department. They described how Sheriff Hutchinson had turned law enforcement officers into tools of personal revenge, ordering them to harass citizens who had done nothing wrong. The federal government launched its own investigation into civil rights violations, and the state attorney general's office began reviewing every case and arrest that had occurred during Sheriff Hutchinson's tenure. Dozens of charges were dismissed, and the county faced millions of dollars in potential lawsuits from victims of her abuse. My own reputation was completely restored once the truth came out. The same people who had been avoiding me and treating me with suspicion now went out of their way to apologize and show their support. Jim Morrison at the bank shook my hand and told me he was proud of me for standing up to corruption. The manager at the feed store offered me a discount on all my purchases for the rest of the year. Even Pete, my neighbor, came over to my fence line the morning after Sheriff Hutchinson's arrest to make amends. "I should have stood by you from the beginning," he said, looking ashamed. "I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I was scared she would come after me next if I spoke up." "You do not have to apologize, Pete. She had everyone scared. That was how she maintained her power." "Well, she does not have any power now, and I want you to know that if anything like this ever happens again, I will be standing right beside you." The town council held an emergency meeting to discuss the future of the sheriff's department. They appointed Marcus Cole as interim sheriff until a proper election could be held, and they implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse of power. The local newspaper ran an editorial praising the citizens who had come forward to expose the corruption, and specifically mentioning my role in organizing the resistance to Sheriff Hutchinson's reign of terror. They called me a hero and an example of how ordinary people can stand up to injustice when they work together. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a phone call from the district attorney's office informing me that Sheriff Hutchinson had agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She would serve 5 years in state prison and would never be allowed to work in law enforcement again. Justice had finally been served, but the real victory was knowing that no other innocent person would have to endure what she had put me and so many others through. 6 months after Sheriff Hutchinson's conviction, my ranch was finally at peace again. The cattle that had been scattered and traumatized during her raid were healthy and calm. The fences she had ordered torn down were rebuilt stronger than before. The barn that her deputies had destroyed was now a modern facility with better equipment and storage. But the most important changes were not visible from the outside. The community of Cedar Falls had learned valuable lessons about the importance of standing up to corruption and supporting each other when authority figures abuse their power. I found myself in the unexpected role of an advocate for others facing similar situations. People from neighboring counties would call me for advice when they encountered harassment from corrupt officials. I helped them organize their evidence, connect with honest law enforcement officers, and find lawyers who specialized in civil rights cases. The group that had formed to oppose Sheriff Hutchinson evolved into a permanent citizens watchdog organization. We attended town council meetings, monitored police activities, and made sure that the reforms implemented after her arrest were being followed. We also worked with the state legislature to strengthen laws protecting citizens from abuse of power by law enforcement. Tom Wilson's horse ranch was thriving again, with new customers who had heard about his courage in standing up to corruption. Sarah Chen's trucking company had recovered all the business she lost during the harassment campaign and was expanding into new markets. Frank Rodriguez's auto repair shop had become the most popular in the county, partly because of his reputation for integrity, and partly because people wanted to support someone who had suffered for doing the right thing. Marcus Cole won the election for sheriff by the largest margin in county history. He implemented community policing programs, established citizen review boards, and created transparent procedures for handling complaints against deputies. The culture of the sheriff's department was completely transformed from what it had been under Sheriff Hutchinson. My relationship with my neighbors was stronger than it had ever been. Pete and I worked together on several projects, including a new irrigation system that benefited both our properties. The other ranchers in the area formed a cooperative to share equipment and resources, creating the kind of mutual support network that Sheriff Hutchinson had tried to destroy with her divide-and-conquer tactics. The experience taught me that corruption thrives when good people remain silent and isolated. Sheriff Hutchinson was able to abuse her power for as long as she did because her victims were afraid to speak up and work together. Once we overcame that fear and started supporting each other, her power crumbled quickly. I also learned that standing up to injustice requires patience, planning, and persistence. The temptation was always there to respond to her harassment with anger and confrontation, but that would have played into her hands and given her justification for her actions. Instead, we documented everything, built our case carefully, and waited for the right moment to expose her crimes. Most importantly, I learned that ordinary citizens have more power than they realize when they work together within the legal system. Sheriff Hutchinson seemed untouchable when she was harassing us individually, but she was just another criminal when faced with organized opposition and proper evidence. Today, my ranch is not just a place where I raise cattle. It has become a symbol of what happens when people refuse to be intimidated by corrupt authority and fight back through legal means. Visitors sometimes drive by just to see the place where Sheriff Karen Hutchinson's reign of terror finally came to an end. The sunrise still looks the same over my pasture every morning, but it feels different now. It feels like the dawn of a new era of justice and community in Cedar Falls, built on the foundation of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when faced with the choice between submission and resistance.